one of the important elements of this, trying to understand the global economy and how it impacts on public health and equality, is the transnational corporation. And the transnational corporation, for several reasons. One is that many of the transnational corporations are essentially oligopolies or monopolies, and therefore have massive pricing power. Secondly, because they also control the global supply chains which they're sitting on, and in the Australian context, the way in which the big retailers are able to pressurise the farmers and the retail workers illustrates the way in which that supply chain control operates. And thirdly, because they have a great deal of political power. In terms of trying to bring in a 12-minute presentation some sense as to how the transnational corporations fit into the picture that we're discussing, I've elected to talk about the big pharma as partly because it's so important to healthcare, but partly because it's a transnational, an industry dominated by transnational corporations. It gives us a sense of what kind of regulatory strategies we might want to be thinking about, and something about the kind of policy making and political mobilisation that we might wish to use. So in the context of the discussion about globalisation and financialisation and tax, I'm going to look at at big pharma. And the way I'm going to do that is to, first of all, think about the sort of policy objectives that we might expect from the pharmaceutical industry. Secondly, to try and put that in the context of the global economy, and then look at modalities for public regulation. So I'm going to talk about medicines policy objectives, about how well we're currently meeting those objectives, and I'll talk specifically about prices, about standards, about regulation, about rational use and ethical promotion. Make a brief reference to the political economy of big pharma per se, and then look at the issues of global regulation. In terms of policy objectives, I think we might identify four. First of all, about medicines development, both innovation, the evaluation, the investment in priority medicines. We need to think about medicines production and distribution, both the quality, safety and efficacy. We need to look at the equitable access to necessary medicines, which is about procurement, price and supply, but it's also about whether those medicines are being produced. And we need to think about quality use, information, promotion, prescription. So on this next slide, I hope you can read that. I've listed some of the achievements and some of the shortfalls against those four objectives. And in terms of the first one, development, innovation, and so forth, I want to highlight the empty antibiotic pipeline, the fact that we're now facing a massive problem with antimicrobial resistance, and the pipeline is empty because Big Pharma has made the judgment that the profits are not in short-term bouts of antibiotics. They're in the big biologicals for cancer and chronic disease. We're looking at the type 2 diseases, the diseases which principally affect developing countries, where there has also been a drought with respect to investment. And the most obvious case of that was Ebola, that we've had Ebola around since 1976, but it was never seen by pharma as being an appropriate place to invest. So there's a problem about research and development. In terms of the second row, in terms of production, distribution and so forth, I've highlighted the problem. Some of you may have heard me go on about this yesterday, but to highlight the problem of substandard and falsified medicines, which is a major challenge but has been complicated hugely by the attempt by pharma to conflate the problems of rubbish medicines on the market with the problems of trying to harness the power of state regulation in order to police intellectual property claims. And that's been a major issue and has been a real hold-up in terms of effective action on rubbish medicines. In that same column, I've also listed regulatory capture, and this is a major issue in particular in terms of the current flourish of biologicals, whereby the big pharma is heavily involved in the consultations and the regulatory structures which set medicines regulation in place. One of the issues, for example, has been well, it's a claim. I'm not in a position to evaluate this claim, but the claim is that the standards for manufacturing and good manufacturing practice are in some respects deliberately set too high to prevent developing countries to effectively establish their own domestic industries. I'll leave that with you. I'm not sure, I'm not in a position to make that judgment. The third row, we've talked about affordable access, and the major barrier to affordable access is clearly impossible prices. And the role of intellectual property and other forms of monopoly regulation has been talked about several times at this meeting. The most sort of egregiously in the context of trade negotiations, the continued imposition of extended IP. This would be in this context. You have to look at the claim that IP monopoly profit for the first 20 or 25 years or whatever is needed in order to fund research. And in this context, there are widely differing estimates about the average cost of bringing drugs to market. It is manifestly the case that that Big Pharma spends more of that profit on marketing than it does on research and development. That much of the drug research is actually funded through the public sector, and that there are major gaps in production, which I've referred to, antibiotics and diseases which particularly affect developing countries. So this is a further challenge. And then finally, the issue of inappropriate use and the way in which that's driven by unethical marketing. And in this context, I'd cite the pressures in the context of the TPP negotiations to sanction direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription medicines, which has been something which, of course, happens in many countries, but at least in this country we haven't had it. And it's been it's an illustration of the aggressive marketing. I'm not suggesting, as you can see on this slide, I'm not suggesting there have not been major achievements, because there have been major achievements in all of those four areas. But I'm highlighting what I take to be shortfalls as a way of setting the scene for thinking about regulation. So in terms of medicine prices, I think I've said all this. Just at the bottom of this slide, I've talked about in terms of medicines development, the pressure for an R&D treaty and the pressure for delinking R&D funding from profit from sales. I'm not sure how many people have followed this debate about an R&D treaty. Is this well known? A few people have. What's being suggested is that because of the degree to which funding of R&D is actually public anyway, because of the degree to which the prioritisation is not very good, and because of for these reasons, we need to move away from relying on drug company profits to pay for the research and development, and move to public funding of research and development through an R&D treaty, because either way the public purse pays for provides this money, as in terms of the degree to which medicines access is supported by public benefits, either in hospitals or through schemes like the pharmaceutical benefit scheme in this country. The public is still paying for it, whether you're paying for it through an inflated price after the drug's been produced, or whether you're paying for it by commissioning the research and development to be done, and then be in a position to make those drugs available to people on the basis of need. And given the advent of the new biologicals, this idea of a research and development treaty and more public funding of R&D is absolutely an idea whose time has come. I think I might miss this one. This one is about the failure to effectively act on rubbish medicines, and the degree to which this public regulatory failure has been complicated by the attempt by pharma to harness regulatory powers for their own ends. In terms of regulatory capture, one of the best examples of this would be the EU seizures. People may be familiar about the seizures in Holland and in Frankfurt several years ago of drugs which were in transit from India to Brazil, drugs which were completely legal in India and which were completely legal in Brazil, but these are generic medicines, but which would not have been legal they're quite legal, but they would have been perhaps breaching intellectual property rights if they'd been put on sale in Europe. And the EU, under pressure from Big Pharma, passed regulations which empowered them to seize these drugs in transit in order to throw a spanner in the works of the generic manufacturing. So there's many other examples, and I've mentioned on this slide the role of pharma in what's called the International Conference on Harmonisation. This is harmonisation of drug regulatory standards, but harmonisation in a way that meets the interests of pharma rather than necessarily the availability of drugs. And a particular interest to this audience would be the failure to implement mandatory registration of clinical trials. In terms of rational use and ethical promotion, I don't think we need to go into too much detail on this, except to say that the kind of trade agreements that we've been seeing, both in terms of the World Trade Organization agreements and the regional and bilateral agreements, all have provisions for preventing increased regulation once they come into power. So there's a so-called status quo provisions and ratchet provisions, both in the new agreements and in the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which mean that you can't regulate higher than you can't. It makes it very hard to increase your levels of regulation. So in terms of where this is all coming from, which I've cast under this idea of the political economy of Big Pharma, I'm looking at the degree of market concentration, which is huge, the need for large amounts of money to support basic research, clinical trials, the degree to which the funding of Big Pharma comes from aggressive marketing and aggressive and unethical promotion, And the way in which Big Pharma is working with wider networks of corporate networks globally to promote its agenda. And I'd refer you to a paper by Peter Drahos, which is available on the web. If you just put in Drahos, you'll find it, which talks about the development of the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, and the role of Pfizer in the development of that agreement. Pfizer working closely with the electronics industry, and in order to drive that outcome. So, and of course, Big Pharma and IBM and so forth are, and of course Microsoft, working closely with the leaders of the rich countries in terms of things like the US watch list. I don't know if you're familiar with the watch list, but Big Pharma in the US has got a watch list which says these countries are suspected of doing bad things to our financial interests. And the US Trade Secretary's got his own watch list, and if countries get up on the US Trade Representative's watch list, then they're subject to trade sanctions, and this has happened repeatedly to Thailand. And if you look at the Big Pharma's watch list and the US Trade Rep's watch list, they're very similar. You can see in which the way in which the one becomes the other. Okay, so in terms of, out of that kind of sketch, I want to suggest that some of the main issues we need to think about in terms of the global regulation of pharmaceuticals are things like delinking price setting from the funding of R&D through public funding of R&D and a global treaty, cleaning up global policy making, in particular preventing the putting extreme protections in trade agreements, effective regulation of production and promotion and prescribing. Most importantly, fairer mechanisms of technology transfer and the development of domestic pharmaceutical production in low and middle income countries. And following Miranda's talk, trying to build a funding capacity in low and middle income countries which is able to support access to medicines for people who need them. So to end, I want to end by thinking about the challenges that these perspectives raise for us as public health practitioners and as members of the World Federation and of public health associations. I think it emphasises the need for building our knowledge base and research capacity in relation to macroeconomic issues, financialisation, tax issues. We need to build our policy capacity to participate in these debates about regulation. We need to build capacity in teaching and research in terms of the sort of issues I've talked about. We need to participate in community mobilisation, in international advocacy around the kind of policy objectives. I think these are the challenges I think we should talk about, and some of them are being done, so we can always do them better. In passing, I might just mention that you may have seen the little leaflet which has been published outside in the foyer, which is the World Federation of Public Health Associations Demand for Action, Melbourne, 2017. I'm not sure whether this is open for amendment or not, but it's going to be discussed tomorrow, I believe. And I think we have someone who's planning to do something. Okay, so whether we get some resolutions or ideas out of today's discussion and argue to put them into the State of Melbourne demand, whatever it's called, or not, this is part of the advocacy work of the Federation and of the public health movement itself, and we need to bring these issues of financialisation, of tax principles, and of the regulation of transnationals as part of our regular thinking.